Elias Cross, a determined black man, faces relentless racism in the small town of Maplewood, where the corrupt Sheriff Daniels uses his power to oppress the community. As Elias uncovers Daniels' systemic abuse and discriminatory practices, he finds himself pitted against a town steeped in bias, where even law enforcement and local officials perpetuate racial injustice. The growing tension pushes Elias to the brink as he battles to expose the corruption that has long been hidden, while contending with personal and institutional prejudice that threatens to destroy him. The stakes are high, and the struggle is real. Elias Cross adjusted his navy blazer as he stepped out of his sleek, understated black SUV. The vehicle, a late-model luxury car, blended in well enough, not flashy but undeniably refined, much like the man himself. Maplewood's morning sun stretched long shadows across the cracked pavement of Main Street as he made his way toward the entrance of Grady's Diner, a place where the smell of bacon and strong coffee lingered like a permanent resident. Elias had been here before, not as a stranger passing through, but as a man who chose to remember where he came from. He'd grown up just a few towns over, in a place not so different from this, a place where the weight of perception clung to you, where people judged before they knew, where folks whispered stories instead of asking questions. Yet, despite the scars of his upbringing, Elias never distanced himself from towns like Maplewood. In fact, he felt drawn to them. He paused in front of the diner, glancing at the neon sign that buzzed faintly in the quiet morning air. Grady's since 1964, it proclaimed, though it looked like nothing had changed since that year, except for the coat of paint peeling near the window. Inside, he could already see the usual crowd. Truckers in flannel hunched over their plates, small-town lawyers arguing their cases over black coffee, and retirees who'd claimed their spots decades ago. The door jingled as Elias stepped inside, his presence turning only a few heads. He wasn't flashy, wasn't someone who invited attention unless he wanted it. His dark brown complexion, sharply cut jawline, and salt and pepper beard framed a face that wore success without boasting it. Yet what most people never realized was that Elias Cross wasn't just another well-dressed stranger. He was one of the most powerful men in the state, a CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. But here, at Grady's, he was just another customer, and he liked it that way. Elias chose a booth near the window, setting down his leather briefcase before pulling out a small notepad. It was a habit of his, to write down thoughts, plans, or even the occasional stray idea that crossed his mind. Before he could so much as uncap his pen, a waitress appeared by his side, clutching a worn-out notepad of her own. "Morning," she greeted him, her tone flat, almost perfunctory. "Coffee?" "Please," Elias replied with a warm smile, as if they were old friends. The waitress, a woman who looked to be in her mid-50s with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Linda, poured the coffee with practiced indifference. Her gaze lingered on Elias a second longer than necessary, as though trying to decide something about him. "Here for work?" she asked, tilting her head toward his briefcase. "Something like that," Elias said simply, not offering more. He wasn't offended by her curiosity, it came with the territory. Linda didn't press him further, though something in her expression hinted at an assumption made, a box checked before he'd even spoken. She turned on her heel and disappeared toward the counter. Elias leaned back, sipping the bitter coffee as he took in the hum of the diner. Conversations floated around him. A man 2 tables over complained about property taxes, while another boasted about his son's recent football win. It was normal, comfortable, except for the tension, subtle as it was, that seemed to ripple through the room. It wasn't his imagination, he could feel it. The whispers started small. A couple of looks, quick, half-second glances, traveled across the room. A man in a grease-stained trucker's hat muttered something to his companion. Elias had seen it before. He'd been met with this kind of quiet resistance in more boardrooms than he could count, where men in suits smiled through gritted teeth. But here, in Maplewood, the disapproval was less subtle, its weight pressing on him like an unseen hand. 2 seats down at the counter, a tall man in a sheriff's uniform shifted in his seat. Officer Grayson Daniels. Elias didn't need the nameplate or the hard-eyed stare to know his type. Small-town authority, complete with the smug posture of someone who thought his word was law. Daniel's eyes locked onto Elias, for just a moment longer than was polite, his gaze flat and assessing. Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he took another slow sip of his coffee, letting the moment pass. Linda returned with a plate balanced on her arm. "Oatmeal with fruit, no sugar. That right?" "Perfect," Elias said, grateful for the familiarity of the small meal he'd always ordered. She lingered for a second longer, her lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Don't get many visitors like you around here." "People like me?" Elias asked softly, his tone even. Linda's face flushed slightly as she fumbled for an answer. "You know, folks who look like they belong somewhere else, somewhere bigger." Elias smiled faintly. "Maplewood feels big enough for me today." Before she could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and two men entered, their voices loud and boisterous. They were big, built like linebackers, and wore the kind of denim and boots that screamed hard labor. One of them elbowed his companion and nodded toward Elias's table. "Look at that," the taller one said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Didn't know we had visiting royalty." Elias looked up briefly, meeting their eyes with the calm, composed expression he'd perfected over the years. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "Easy, Randy," Linda muttered, shooting them a look as she passed with a tray of pancakes. The man, Randy, grinned wide, his voice dropping into a mockingly polite tone. "Just saying. It's nice to see someone all dressed up for breakfast. You got a meeting with the governor or something, mister?" A few patrons chuckled under their breath. Daniels, the sheriff, didn't even try to hide his smirk. Elias set his spoon down and looked Randy in the eye. His voice was calm and steady, cutting through the low noise of the diner. "No meeting with the governor, just a quiet breakfast before a long day." Randy snorted. "Must be nice to have a long day in a fancy suit. Most of us ain't got that luxury." Elias smiled again, unfazed. "The suit doesn't make the man, friend, hard work does." Randy's grin faltered for a moment before he rolled his shoulders, looking around as if daring someone to laugh with him. No one did. Elias turned his attention back to his notepad, forcing himself to focus on the words he wanted to write instead of the tension simmering in the room. It was nothing new. He'd built a life on staying steady under pressure, calm in the face of hostility. Yet even as he jotted down a reminder for his afternoon meeting, he could feel the eyes lingering on him. Daniel's gaze hadn't moved. Randy and his companion sat loudly at the counter, muttering under their breath, their laughter carrying just enough bite. Elias didn't let it show, but he knew the storm was brewing. It always did. In rooms like this, the difference between calm and conflict was often just one word away. For now, Elias let the diner hum around him, his focus on the faint glow of sunlight spilling through the window. This town had no idea who he was or what kind of man they were poking. He liked it that way, for now. Ban John Noi. Continue from the opening scene and write the next 1,500 words, focusing on the development of the initial conflict between the protagonist and the individuals or system they encounter. Focus areas for this section. Highlight prejudice and biases. Show how the supporting characters, e.g., police officers, store managers, judges, or other authority figures, underestimate or mistreat the protagonist based on racial biases or assumptions about their appearance. Use both subtle microaggressions and overt acts of discrimination to escalate tension. Protagonist's reaction. Showcase how the protagonist remains calm and professional despite the growing injustice. Highlight their internal struggle between anger and maintaining composure. Build the tension. Gradually escalate the conflict, creating a sense of frustration and helplessness for the protagonist while making the audience empathize deeply with their plight. Tone and pacing. Keep the narrative engaging and realistic, balancing vivid descriptions of the events with emotional insight into the protagonist's experience. Instructions. Write this section to establish the stakes and deepen the audience's connection with the protagonist. Build anticipation for a major turning point in the next section. When finished, confirm readiness to proceed to prompt 4 for the pivotal moment of the story. ChatGPT John Noi. ChatGPT. Elias Cross sat in the booth, his spoon circling the oatmeal absently as the tension in Grady's diner continued to simmer. He was no stranger to moments like this. They always started small, side glances, whispers, or jokes that seemed harmless on the surface but carried weight underneath. Today, Randy and his friend were the catalyst, but Elias had a feeling the sheriff, Grayson Daniels, wouldn't stay quiet much longer. The low murmur of voices floated through the diner, forks scraped against plates, boots thudded softly on the worn linoleum floor, but beneath the veneer of normalcy, Elias could feel it. Them, watching, measuring. Daniels finally pushed back from the counter. The wooden legs of his stool scraped loudly as he stood, hands on his belt buckle, fingers grazing the holstered gun on his hip. Deliberately, or absent-mindedly, Elias couldn't be sure. The sheriff adjusted his hat before sauntering over to Elias's table, his shadow falling across the oatmeal. "Morning," Daniels said, his drawl slow and deliberate. His lips curled just enough to resemble a smile, but his pale blue eyes were cold. "Didn't catch your name." Elias looked up, setting his spoon down carefully. "Didn't offer it." A flicker of irritation flashed across Daniels's face, gone so fast it might have been imagined. The sheriff rocked back on his heels, arms folding over his chest as he surveyed Elias like a curiosity, something that didn't belong. "You visiting family?" Daniels asked, voice casual. "No." "Business then?" Elias paused just long enough to let the silence speak for itself. He'd played this game before. Words were currency, and sometimes it was better not to spend them. Daniel's jaw tightened as the lack of response hung in the air. "Thing is," the sheriff continued, his tone harder now, "a man like you don't usually find his way to Maplewood. You know what I mean by a man like you, right?" Elias's eyes didn't waver. "You mean a black man?" The sheriff's smirk turned thin. "Now, don't go twisting my words. I'm just saying we don't see a lot of city types roll through here unless they're looking for trouble or trying to buy up property." Elias took another sip of his coffee, ignoring the growing heat in his chest. Daniels had given up on subtlety. This was about establishing dominance. In towns like this, authority wasn't just enforced with a badge, it was spoken in threats, veiled just enough to sound legal. "I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff," Elias said calmly. "Just having breakfast? Is that a crime in Maplewood?" The quiet in the diner deepened. All eyes were on them now, though no one dared intervene. Randy and his friend muttered something under their breath, laughing in low tones like schoolyard bullies who knew someone else was about to do their dirty work. "Breakfast, huh?" Daniels mused, pulling up the chair across from Elias and sitting down uninvited. The wood groaned under his weight. "Thing is, I've got a responsibility to keep an eye on folks passing through. You'd understand that, wouldn't you?" Elias stared at the sheriff, his calm exterior betraying none of the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I understand a lot of things, Sheriff Daniels, like how this conversation doesn't seem to be about breakfast anymore." Daniels leaned in slightly, the air between them thick. "I'll be plain with you, some folks might get the wrong impression about strangers showing up unannounced, like they're here to make changes. Maplewood don't need changes. Or maybe," Elias replied softly, "it doesn't want them." The words hit their mark. Daniel's face flushed, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. A loud clatter interrupted the silence. Randy, slamming his coffee mug onto the counter. "You hear that?" Randy called out to no one in particular. "Fella thinks he's smarter than us, thinks he knows how our town works." The few patrons who'd been trying to ignore the scene now shifted uncomfortably. Linda glanced nervously from the counter, her face pale. Elias could see the conflict on her face, whether to step in or stay out of it. She chose the latter. Daniels smiled thinly, rising to his feet. "Be careful with that mouth, mister," he said, his voice low. "You don't want to rile folks up, just enjoy your oatmeal and move along when you're done, that'd be my advice." Elias didn't respond. He watched as Daniels adjusted his belt and swaggered back toward the counter, where Randy and his companion clapped him on the back like he'd won something. It was familiar. Too familiar. Elias had seen this playbook 1,000 times. The whispers, the advice, the undercurrent of aggression. If he was anyone else, this might have worked. The man they saw was just a stranger, black, polished, quiet. A man they could intimidate and push out the door with a few threats. What they didn't realize was who they were dealing with. Elias finished his coffee and measured sips, watching Daniels out of the corner of his eye. Randy and his friends still laughed too loudly at their own jokes. It was as though the room itself was daring him to leave. But Elias Cross didn't walk away, not anymore. As he paid his bill at the counter, Linda avoided his gaze, her hands shaking slightly as she took the cash. "You didn't have to let that happen," Elias said softly. Her lips pressed together, her gaze fixed on the counter. "You're better off just going, mister. You don't know this town like I do." Elias gave her a long look before turning toward the door, pocketing his change. Outside, the air was cooler than before. Elias moved toward his SUV, his steps slow and deliberate, as though daring someone to follow him. The door jingled behind him, and he heard heavy boots striking pavement. "Hey!" Elias turned to see Randy striding toward him, his companion trailing close behind. "What is it now?" Elias asked, his voice tired but steady. Randy stopped a few feet short, his chest puffed out. "Men like you don't belong here," he said, spitting the words out like venom. Elias tilted his head slightly. "And what kind of man is that exactly?" Randy faltered for half a second before recovering. "The kind who thinks he's better than us. You roll in here with your suit and fancy car, acting like you own the place." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I didn't act like I owned anything. I paid for breakfast like anyone else. You're the one making this about something it's not." Randy took a step closer. Big words from someone who doesn't know his place. Elias smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I know exactly where my place is. It's you who's having trouble figuring that out." The subtle dig made Randy's face turn crimson. His hand curled into a fist at his side. For a moment, Elias wondered if the man would swing. He didn't move. He didn't have to. Behind Randy, the diner door opened again. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his expression cold and watchful. "That's enough," Daniels called, though his tone was almost bored, as if the whole thing were beneath him. "Go on, Randy, leave him be." Randy hesitated but obeyed, backing up with one last glare at Elias. "This ain't over," he muttered, before stomping off. Elias turned to Daniels. "Interesting friends you've got, Sheriff." Daniels didn't rise to the bait. "Like I said, Mr. Cross, best you move along before you wear out your welcome." Elias's calm mask remained in place, but inside, a quiet storm brewed. He'd spent his life earning everything he had, climbing farther than anyone expected him to, proving doubters wrong at every turn. Yet, here he was, in a town like Maplewood, being reduced to a stereotype, a problem to be managed, a man who didn't belong. "Thanks for the advice, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice even. "But I don't take directions from small men pretending to be big." For the first time, something flickered in Daniel's eyes, a warning. Elias didn't wait for a response. He turned, stepped into his SUV, and closed the door with deliberate calm. Through the windshield, he saw Daniels watching him, hands on his belt, chin lifted like a man who thought he'd won. Elias started the engine, but as he pulled away, one thought stuck with him. "This town doesn't know it yet, but it's going to learn who I am." And when it did, Maplewood would never forget the name Elias Cross. The sun had barely hit its peak when Elias Cross found himself back in the center of Maplewood, this time parked outside the courthouse, a building with faded white columns and a sagging American flag hanging limp in the still air. It wasn't his first choice of destination, but when someone like Grayson Daniels decided to mark you as a problem, you had two choices. You could run, or you could face it head-on. Elias never ran. He stepped out of his SUV, the confident click of his polished shoes carrying across the parking lot. The small-town whispers had traveled faster than he had. As he approached the courthouse steps, he noticed the sideways glances of townsfolk lingering nearby. Some curious, others openly suspicious. Officer Grayson Daniels was waiting for him near the entrance, flanked by two other deputies who looked as eager as pit bulls straining at their leashes. Daniels wore his badge high, his hand resting on the belt near his holster, like it belonged there. "Well, look who decided to stick around," Daniels drawled, his smirk barely concealing the venom underneath. "You just can't take a hint, can you?" Elias didn't stop moving. "Is there a reason I'm here, Sheriff? Or is loitering considered a crime in Maplewood?" Daniel's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Funny you should ask, Mr. Cross. I've got some questions about that fancy car of yours." Elias slowed, his brow furrowing. "My car?" Daniel's tone hardened. "Oh yeah, word is, it matches the description of a vehicle involved in some suspicious activity over in Blackwater County. Seems a little too coincidental, don't you think? Elias straightened, understanding where this was going. It was the oldest trick in the book. Manufacture a reason to drag him in, poke and prod until they got something to stick, or at least humiliate him enough to send him packing. I see, Elias said coolly. Well, I'm sure you have evidence to back up these questions. Because if not, Sheriff, you're wasting my time. The deputies tensed. Daniel's smile turned sharp, like a blade. Why don't we let you explain that at the station? It's just a little chat. You understand, don't you, standard procedure? Standard procedure, Elias repeated softly. For a man like me. Daniel's face hardened. You accusing me of something, Cross? Elias's stare didn't waver. I'm not accusing you of anything, Sheriff. I'm just curious why a black man in a tailored suit happens to be the only person you found suspicious in this town. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling out and catching the attention of nearby passers-by. A murmur began to spread, but Daniels wasn't listening. He took a step closer, invading Elias's space. You're coming with us, Daniels said, the threat in his voice unmistakable. Either willingly or not. Elias knew when the line had been crossed. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes watching, the invisible walls closing in. Daniels wanted him to push back, to give him an excuse to escalate the situation into something ugly. Fine, Elias said finally, his voice calm but firm. I'll come with you. But make no mistake, Sheriff, you're making a mistake you won't be able to take back. Is that right? Daniels sneered. Elias didn't answer. He allowed himself to be flanked by the deputies, their hands brushing too close to his arms as they led him toward the waiting patrol car. From across the street, a familiar voice called out, "What the hell's going on here?" Elias turned just enough to spot Mitchell Grady, the town's only lawyer worth his salt, jogging across the courthouse lawn. A graying man in his early 60s, Mitchell was the kind of small-town lawyer who believed in justice, even when it wasn't easy to find. He looked from Daniels to Elias, his expression sharp with suspicion. "Daniels, what's this about?" Mitchell barked. "None of your business, Mitchell," Daniels shot back. "This here's an ongoing investigation." "Investigation into what?" Mitchell demanded. "The man just got here yesterday. You can't seriously think he's up to something." Daniels' lip curled. "Maybe I do. Maybe we'll find out once we've had a little talk at the station." Mitchell looked at Elias, his concern clear. "Elias, do you want me to accompany you? You don't have to go in without representation." "I'll be fine," Elias said, though the words tasted bitter. "Thank you, Mitchell." Daniels snorted. "Of course he'll be fine. We're just doing our jobs here, aren't we?" The deputies shoved Elias into the back seat of the patrol car, their hands lingering longer than necessary. As the door slammed shut, Elias let his eyes drift back to Mitchell, who stood on the curb watching them drive away with barely concealed outrage. The ride to the station was short, but heavy with silence. Elias sat with his hands resting calmly on his lap, his posture regal. Despite the humiliation of being caged behind steel doors, the sheriff's station was small, outdated, and filled with the kind of men who didn't have much else to do in a quiet town but sit and wait for trouble to walk through the door. Elias was escorted inside, his footsteps echoing as they led him past rows of desks and suspicious stares. Daniels didn't stop until they reached an interrogation room. Gray walls, a metal table, and a camera blinking quietly in the corner. "Have a seat," Daniels ordered. Elias lowered himself into the chair, his movements unhurried. Daniels remained standing, looming over him like a man who thought size equaled power. "Let's get something straight," the sheriff said, his voice low. "I don't care who you are or what kind of money you've got around here, you play by our rules." "And what rules would those be exactly?" Elias asked. Daniels leaned closer, his face inches from Elias's. "The kind that remind you where you stand." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the silence sharp as broken glass. Elias could feel the old rage creeping up his spine, the anger he'd spent years learning to temper. He could hear his father's voice, from long ago. "They'll try to break you, son, but don't let them see you bend." Elias smiled faintly, his calm demeanor a direct challenge to Daniel's hostility. "Sheriff, I think you're going to regret this little show you're putting on." Daniels laughed, the sound cold. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes," Elias replied, his voice soft but steady. "Because you're making it very clear to me, and everyone else in this town, just how afraid you are." Daniels's smirk faltered. "I'm not afraid of you, Cross." "No. Not of me. Of what I represent, progress, change, a world that doesn't revolve around men like you anymore." The words landed hard. Daniel's face turned red, his jaw clenching as he grabbed the back of Elias's chair, leaning down until his breath hit Elias's face. "You better watch yourself," Daniels hissed. "A man can disappear real easy out here." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" Daniels straightened, his hand twitching toward his belt again. "You're free to go," he snapped suddenly, his voice tight. Elias blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Daniels said through gritted teeth. "Get out of my sight before I change my mind." Elias rose slowly, smoothing his jacket. He knew better than to ask questions Daniels had pushed too far, and now he was pulling back before things unraveled. Elias moved to the door, pausing to glance back. "You might think you won this round, Sheriff, but you haven't," he said evenly. "You just proved everything I needed to know." Daniels didn't respond. He stood rigidly, fists curled at his sides, as Elias walked out of the station, his shoes echoing like a countdown. Outside, the sunlight hit him square in the face, bright and unrelenting. Mitchell was waiting by Elias's SUV, arms crossed. "What the hell happened?" Mitchell demanded. Elias shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Sheriff Daniels just handed me exactly what I needed, now it's time to use it." Mitchell frowned. "Use it how?" Elias looked back at the station, his gaze hard. "By reminding this town that no one is untouchable." Maplewood was about to learn who Elias Cross really was. Elias Cross sat in his SUV, fingers drumming softly against the steering wheel as his mind raced. The faint echo of Sheriff Daniels' parting words still lingered in his head like a sour note. "A man can disappear real easy out here." Daniels wasn't bluffing. Men like him rarely did. Elias looked out across Maplewood's main street, the small town charm now laced with an ugliness he could no longer ignore. He had spent years building his reputation, his empire, moving through rooms full of people who underestimated him, only to find themselves outplayed at their own game. But this was different. Maplewood didn't play by corporate rules. Here, Daniels was the system, and Elias was the outsider, but they had underestimated him. Again. A sharp knock on the driver's side window broke his focus. Mitchell Grady leaned in, his expression pinched with concern. Elias unlocked the door, and the lawyer climbed into the passenger seat without asking. "You okay?" Mitchell asked, voice low. Elias exhaled slowly, forcing his calm exterior back into place. "I'm fine." Mitchell snorted, clearly unconvinced. "No, you're not. You were in there for barely an hour, but Daniels had that look, the one he gets when he's playing games." "What happened?" Elias turned his gaze to Mitchell, a glint of steel in his eyes. "He accused me of driving a suspicious vehicle. We both know that's nonsense. It's not about a car, Mitchell. It's about a message." Mitchell's lips tightened, and he let out a frustrated sigh. "He's testing you, trying to make you feel small so you'll leave. It's what he does to anyone he doesn't like, especially folks who don't look like they fit." Elias shook his head, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "It won't work. Daniels doesn't know who he's dealing with." Mitchell studied him for a long moment. "He's dangerous, Elias. You might think you can fight him, but Maplewood has a way of eating people alive when they stand alone." "Then I won't stand alone," Elias replied firmly. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "I need leverage," Elias said. "If Daniels is corrupt, and I'd bet my bottom dollar he is, then he's left a trail somewhere. I just need to find it." Mitchell leaned back, suddenly uneasy. "Elias, Daniels controls everything in this town, police records, courts, even some of the local businesses. If he's dirty, he's not going to let you expose him without a fight." "Then it's a fight he'll get," Elias said, his voice low and calm. Mitchell ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I'll help you as much as I can, but you need to tread carefully. You're kicking a hornet's nest." Elias looked out the window again, his gaze distant. Hornets only sting when you let them swarm. I'm not here to swat. I'm here to burn the nest to the ground. The next morning, Elias found himself back in Maplewood's heart, this time in the unassuming county clerk's office. It was a small building, its yellowed walls lined with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Elias wore a simple black sweater and slacks, no blazer, no pretense. He'd learned early in life that confidence didn't always need decoration. Morning, a young woman behind the counter greeted cautiously, her eyes lingering on Elias with the same guarded curiosity he'd come to expect. "Good morning," Elias replied smoothly, offering a polite smile. "I'm looking for public records, property transactions. Specifically, I'm hoping you can help." Her brow furrowed slightly, and she hesitated. "You got a reason for that. Most folks don't go digging through those unless they're buying something." "Let's just say I'm curious about who owns what," Elias replied, keeping his tone even. "Is there a problem?" She looked around, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "No problem. It's just that Sheriff Daniels doesn't like folks poking around the town's business." Elias leaned forward slightly. "I'm not interested in gossip, I'm interested in facts. If the records are public, I have every right to see them." Her uncertainty flickered for a moment longer before she nodded, sliding a clipboard toward him. "Fill this out, and I'll pull what I can." "Thank you," Elias said, his smile unwavering. As he filled out the form, he could feel the walls watching him. Quiet, suffocating, like the entire town had ears. Daniels had eyes everywhere, and Elias knew it was only a matter of time before someone tipped him off about this visit. Still, he couldn't stop now. An hour later, Elias sat at a small wooden table buried under stacks of dusty folders and brittle documents. He flipped through page after page, his sharp eyes scanning for patterns, names, connections, anomalies. Then he found it. A series of property transfers from the past 2 years, all suspiciously cheap. The names on the documents shifted frequently, bouncing between shell companies and individuals who had no real business owning land, but every trail led back to one name: Grayson Daniels. "Gotcha," Elias murmured to himself. He took out his phone and snapped pictures of the records. If Daniels thought Maplewood was his personal kingdom, Elias had just found the cracks in his throne. By the time Elias stepped out of the clerk's office, the sun was high, and the tension in the air had thickened. His instincts screamed at him before he even saw it. A patrol car parked half a block away, its engine idling. Daniels was watching. Elias turned the corner, slipping out of sight, his pace steady, but unhurried. He made it back to his SUV, but as soon as he opened the door, another vehicle screeched to a stop behind him. Daniels emerged from the driver's seat, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Where have you been, Cross?" Elias met his gaze without flinching. "Running errands? Didn't know I needed your permission." Daniels took a menacing step closer. "You think you're clever, don't you? Digging through records, asking questions, you don't know what you're messing with." "Oh, I think I do," Elias said, his voice calm and deliberate. "And it scares you." Daniels' eyes flashed with something dangerous. Without warning, he grabbed Elias by the arm, spinning him around and shoving him hard against the SUV. "You're under arrest." "For what?" Elias demanded, his voice sharp. Daniels leaned in, his breath hot against Elias's ear. "I'll think of something." The cuffs snapped around Elias's wrists, cold and tight. The holding cell at the sheriff's station smelled of sweat and stale air. Elias sat on the bench, his back straight, his demeanor unbroken despite the indignity of it all. Outside the bars, Daniels watched him with a twisted smirk, leaning casually against the wall. "You're not as smart as you think, Cross," Daniels said finally. "You come into my town, stir up trouble, and think you'll walk away clean?" Elias lifted his gaze, calm as ever. "I don't think I'll walk away, Daniels, I know I will." The sheriff's smile faded slightly, his mask slipping just enough for Elias to see the insecurity underneath. "Enjoy your time in there, you'll be staying longer than you think." Daniels turned on his heel and left the room. Elias exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the situation settle in his chest. Daniels wasn't bluffing. He'd do everything in his power to keep Elias locked up, to break him, to silence him. But Elias Cross didn't break. As the hours stretched on, Elias's mind sharpened. Strategizing, Daniels had power in Maplewood, but power built on lies was always vulnerable. The records he'd found were enough to unravel everything: the land deals, the fraud, the corruption. But he needed help to expose it. When the heavy metal door creaked open, Elias looked up to see Mitchell standing there, his expression grim. "I got you out," Mitchell said quietly, holding up a signed release form. "Daniels pulled every trick in the book to keep you here, but I called in a favor with the county judge." Elias stood, rolling his shoulders as he stepped out of the cell. "Good work, Mitchell." Mitchell frowned. "You're not stopping, are you?" Elias shook his head, his eyes hard with resolve. "Not a chance." Mitchell sighed. "Then you better move fast, because Daniels is coming for you hard." Elias smiled faintly, his calm returning. "Let him come. He's not ready for what's next." As he walked out of the station into the cool evening air, Elias knew one thing for certain. Maplewood's days of silence were over. Daniel's grip was slipping, and Elias was about to pull the whole rotten system down with him. Elias Cross stood in the middle of Maplewood's courthouse steps, his silhouette sharp against the golden haze of the evening sun. A crowd had gathered, small at first, but growing news in a town like Maplewood traveled fast, and nothing traveled faster than a man daring to challenge its most powerful figure. Sheriff Grayson Daniels' patrol car rumbled toward the curb, dust spiraling up from the tires. The air felt tight, the kind of quiet that comes just before a storm. Elias adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate calm as Daniels emerged, flanked by 2 deputies. The sheriff wore his authority like a second skin, chest puffed, hat low, gun strapped tight to his hip. But there was something else, too. Elias could see it in his stride, in the way his fingers tapped impatiently against his belt. Unease. Daniels was many things: corrupt, arrogant, dangerous, but he wasn't stupid. He knew something was coming. The crowd shifted as the sheriff approached, forming an invisible circle around the 2 men. Daniels stopped a few feet away, close enough to intimidate, but far enough to avoid provoking anything he couldn't control. "Cross," Daniels said, his voice carrying over the low murmur of onlookers, "I hear you've been running your mouth all over town." Elias smiled faintly. "I didn't have to, Sheriff. The truth speaks for itself." Daniels' jaw tightened. "The only truth around here is the one I decide, and right now, the truth is that you don't belong. You come here, digging through our business, stirring up good people, and for what? To make yourself feel important." "No, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice calm but firm, "to hold you accountable." Daniel's face reddened. "Careful, Cross, you're playing with fire." Elias took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to show he wasn't afraid. "Let me tell you what I found, Sheriff," he said, voice carrying just loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "I found property transfers, dozens of them. Shady deals made through shell companies that all lead back to you public land, small businesses, all scooped up for pennies on the dollar. And it doesn't stop there, does it?" Daniel's eyes darkened, his smirk fading into something colder. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," Elias pressed on. "You've been skimming from the very people you swore to protect kickbacks, bribes. You sell off this town piece by piece, and then you cover your tracks with intimidation and threats. Sound familiar?" The crowd began to stir now, quiet murmurs spreading through the sea of faces. Daniels glanced sideways, noticing the shift. People were listening, really listening, and that was dangerous. "Folks around here know me, Cross," Daniels said, his voice rough with anger. "They know what I've done for this town. What have you done? You're just some outsider with a fancy suit and a big mouth." Elias's eyes narrowed. "What I've done, Sheriff, is expose you for what you are: a liar, a thief, and a coward who uses his badge as a shield." Daniels lunged forward, his finger jabbing toward Elias's chest. "You shut your damn mouth!" "Or what?" Elias cut him off, his voice rising just enough to match the tension. "You'll throw me in a cell again, cook up more lies. That's what you're good at, isn't it, Daniels? Turning the law into a weapon." The sheriff's face twisted with fury, but before he could speak, another voice rang out. "Is it true?" Heads turned. An older man in a grease-stained cap stepped forward, his voice shaky but clear. Elias recognized him as one of the mechanics from the edge of town. "What he's saying, is it true, Grayson?" Daniels didn't answer. The moment of hesitation spoke louder than words. The mechanic looked around, catching the eyes of others in the crowd. Faces Elias had seen in the diner, on the streets, watching him with suspicion just hours earlier. Now those same faces reflected something new: doubt. Elias pressed his advantage, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "How many of you have lost land or business deals you couldn't explain? How many of you were told it was just bad luck or the way things worked in Maplewood? Daniels didn't just steal from you. He counted on you being too afraid to question it." "You shut up!" Daniels snapped, his voice cracking as the thin veneer of control slipped. "You don't know anything about this town." "No, you don't," Elias shot back, stepping toward him. "Maplewood isn't yours to control. It belongs to the people standing here, the people you betrayed." Daniel's hand twitched toward his belt, where his gun rested. The crowd gasped as his fingers brushed the holster. For one sharp moment, everything seemed to freeze. The sheriff's rage, Elias's unflinching calm, the crowd holding its collective breath. Daniel's eyes blazed with frustration, his authority crumbling before him. "Go ahead," Elias said quietly, his tone deadly calm. "Draw it. Show them who you really are." Daniel's hand froze, his chest rising and falling as he realized he'd been backed into a corner. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. People were moving, whispering, pulling out their phones to record the scene. Daniels knew it. This wasn't just between him and Elias anymore. "You're done, Sheriff," Elias continued, his voice carrying like a judge's sentence. "I've sent everything I found to the county prosecutor's office, the state investigators, and the media. Your time's up." Daniel's face went pale. You're bluffing." Elias smiled faintly. "Try me." For a beat, Daniel said nothing, his face a mess of fury and disbelief. Finally, he turned sharply on his heel, pushing through the crowd toward his patrol car. The door slammed behind him, the tires screeching as he sped off down the street, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. A strange, heavy quiet settled over the square. Slowly, faces turned to Elias, some hesitant, others quietly hopeful. "Is it true?" the mechanic asked again, his voice breaking the silence. "Did you really send it all?" Elias nodded. "Every last detail." A murmur of relief spread through the crowd, mixed with the slow realization that the man who had ruled over their town unchecked was no longer untouchable. Mitchell Grady appeared at Elias's side, his expression one of amazement and quiet admiration. "I don't know how you pulled that off," he muttered. Elias looked out at the crowd. "I didn't do it alone," he said softly. "They just needed someone to remind them they could stand up." Mitchell let out a breath. "Daniels won't go quietly. You know that, right?" "I know," Elias replied, his voice steady. "But when a system's broken, you don't back down, you break it apart." The crowd began to disperse slowly, whispers of Daniel's fall traveling like wildfire. For now, the sheriff was gone, but Elias knew this was far from over. Daniels was a man backed into a corner, and cornered men were dangerous. But Elias wasn't afraid. As he stood there, the sun sinking low behind the courthouse, he felt it. A shift. The quiet power of a community that had been afraid for too long, finally realizing they could take their town back. Daniels had cracked, and now it was time to finish what had been started. Elias turned to Mitchell, his eyes hard with resolve. "This isn't over yet," he said. Mitchell nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No, but it's a hell of a start." Elias looked down the road where Daniels had disappeared, his shoulders straight and unyielding. "It's time to finish this," he said quietly. And this time, Maplewood would never forget his name. Elias Cross stood in the small town square, the rustle of conversation, and the weight of the crowd's eyes pressing in on him. Sheriff Grayson Daniels was nowhere to be found, but the tension was thick. His absence only deepened the sense of anticipation Maplewood was about to witness a reckoning. But Elias knew better than to assume victory just yet. It wasn't over until Daniels was taken down for good. The sheriff had made his move. He'd tried to silence Elias, to bury him under layers of lies and intimidation. But Elias had seen through it all, piecing together Daniel's corruption and using it as the weapon that would finally bring the man to justice. What Daniels didn't realize was that his grip on the town was slipping, and Elias was just the person to pry it loose. The door to the sheriff's station creaked open, and Elias's sharp eyes caught the movement. Daniels emerged, his hands clenched in fists at his sides, his face contorted with rage. He was flanked by two of his deputies, men who looked more like enforcers than officers of the law, and the way they moved told Elias all he needed to know. Daniels wasn't backing down. He was preparing for a showdown. The crowd sensed it too. Conversation stopped, the murmurs of onlookers slowly fading as they turned to face the impending clash. Daniel's eyes locked onto Elias with an intensity that sent a pulse of electricity through the square. "You've done a good job making a fool of me, Cross," Daniels said, his voice thick with venom. "But you don't know what you're messing with. You've stirred up something you can't stop." Elias didn't flinch. His posture remained straight, shoulders squared. "I think I'm the one who's been telling the truth, Sheriff. You've been hiding behind that badge for far too long." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He glanced at his deputies before turning back to Elias. "You think the people are going to believe you over me? You think I'm going to let you take everything I've worked for?" The weight of his words hung in the air. For the first time, Elias saw the true face of the man before him. The man who used fear to control an entire town. The man who thought his position made him untouchable. Daniels wasn't just a crooked cop. He was a man who had buried his soul under layers of greed, pride, and abuse of power. The revelation made Elias's blood boil. Daniels was a symbol of everything that was wrong in this world, everything Elias had fought against. Elias's voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "The only thing you've worked for is a system built on lies and theft. You've used your power to take from the very people you swore to protect." Daniel's lips curled into a grin, but there was no humor in it. "You really think you're going to take me down, huh? You're one man, Cross. A man who doesn't belong here, in a town that doesn't need your kind of change." The words hit harder than any punch. The slur was subtle, but it was there. Deep-seated racism and prejudice, veiled under the guise of authority. Elias had heard it all his life, seen it in countless faces, from boardrooms to back alleys. It was the insidious kind of hatred that didn't need to shout. It just poisoned everything around it. But Elias wouldn't let it rattle him. He had too much at stake now. Too many lives had been affected by men like Daniels for him to back down. He could feel the weight of the crowd, the townspeople who had long been silenced, watching him. This wasn't just about Daniels anymore. It was about the people of Maplewood, reclaiming their dignity. Elias took a step forward, his voice cutting through the thickening silence. "You're not in control here, Sheriff. The truth is, you're the one who doesn't belong." He paused, his words sinking in. "I've already sent everything I found about your deals to the right people, county prosecutors, the press. You're going to be exposed for who you really are. A man who has used his badge for nothing more than personal gain." Daniels took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out physically. His fists clenched tighter, his fingers trembling with barely contained rage. But then, his eyes flickered toward the crowd, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. He hesitated, a small crack in the armor. "You think you've won, Cross?" Daniels spat, taking a step back. "You think you've got the upper hand? You don't know the half of it. You don't know what I've done to keep this town running. You don't know the sacrifices I've made. I've kept people safe, while you've been running around making trouble." Elias couldn't let that lie stand. "No, Sheriff. You've been keeping yourself safe. You've been using fear and lies to build a kingdom on the backs of the people you're supposed to protect. You've hurt families, you've ruined lives, and now, you've finally been exposed for what you really are." The crowd, once hesitant, began to murmur in agreement. Elias could feel the shift, the turning point. The people of Maplewood were waking up, realizing the truth they had been too afraid to face. Daniels, now visibly shaken, looked around at the growing crowd, his facade beginning to crumble. "You don't know anything about sacrifice, about doing what it takes to survive." His voice cracked, his bravado slipping as he realized the weight of his words. "Oh, I know," Elias replied, his voice low but strong. "I've seen what it takes to survive. I've watched people fight against men like you their whole lives, but not anymore, not in this town." Daniel's eyes darted between Elias and the growing crowd. He saw it now. he wasn't in control. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, piece by piece. And in that moment, he made a choice. With a swift movement, Daniels reached for his sidearm, his fingers brushing the cold steel of the gun in its holster. The crowd gasped, their fear palpable as they instinctively backed away. The tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. The sheriff had drawn the weapon. He was desperate now, desperate to hold on to whatever shred of authority he still had left. Elias didn't flinch. He had trained for moments like this, his heart beat evenly, steady in the face of the threat. He had the crowd's attention now, and he wasn't going to let it slip. "Go ahead," Elias said calmly, his eyes locked on Daniels. "Pull the trigger. Let everyone see what kind of man you really are." Daniels froze. His hand trembled over the gun, and for a moment, Elias saw it. The uncertainty, the fear of being caught in a moment that would define him. The sheriff was a man used to taking control with a gun, with intimidation. But this time, it wasn't going to work. Slowly, Daniel's hand dropped. The gun remained at his side, but the damage had been done. The sheriff, for all his power, had revealed his true nature to everyone watching. The lies, the threats, the corrupt deals, they were all laid bare now. He wasn't a man of justice. He was a man of fear. Elias took a step back, his voice steady as he spoke to the crowd. "This is your moment, Maplewood. This is your chance to take your town back, to stand up for what's right." The crowd stood in stunned silence for a moment. Then, like a slow tide, people began to move. The first few steps were hesitant, but then others joined in, walking toward Daniels. The power had shifted. Daniels could see it in their eyes. They weren't afraid anymore. He had lost them. "Get him out of here," Elias said, his voice sharp. Two of the deputies, their faces twisted with shame, stepped forward, their eyes downcast. They knew what was coming. The sheriff's reign was over. As Daniels was led away in cuffs, Elias turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had witnessed the collapse of the man who had ruled over them with fear. They were free now. Free to rebuild. Free to stand tall. But Elias knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was far from over. The crowd began to disperse, the weight of what had just happened settling in. The town had changed, and there was no going back. But Elias had made his stand. And now, it was time to see it through. As the sun set over Maplewood, Elias knew he had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. The real work was about to start. The air in Maplewood felt different now. The tension that had clung to the town for so long seemed to lift, though a quiet unease still lingered in the corners of the streets and houses. The sheriff had been taken down, his name and his corruption exposed for all to see, but the scars he left on the town, on its people, would take longer to heal. Elias Cross walked down Main Street, the weight of the events that had transpired still heavy on his shoulders, but lighter now than it had been before. He could hear the chatter of the townspeople as they went about their business, some talking about the arrests, others discussing the prospects of a new day, but all of them whispering a common thread. The sheriff had been brought to justice, and a new chapter had begun for Maplewood. But as Elias looked around, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Not for him. When Daniels was arrested that evening, it had been almost anticlimactic. There had been no grand announcement, no explosion of cheers from the crowd. Instead, it had been a quiet, almost somber march to the squad car, as the sheriff was escorted away. The deputies, once so loyal, had now been stripped of their pride, their heads bowed in the face of the truth. They knew it. The sheriff wasn't the man they thought he was. Not anymore. The town of Maplewood had seen too much to let his betrayal go unnoticed. The external forces Elias had contacted, investigative journalists, county officials, even a few trusted lawyers from outside the area, had all moved swiftly in the aftermath. The evidence Elias had painstakingly gathered had been enough to fuel a chain of events that would ultimately lead to Daniel's downfall. The press had arrived just in time, and within hours of the sheriff's arrest, news of his corruption, his bribes, and his illegal dealings had spread like wildfire, setting off a wave of investigations across the county. His power, once absolute, had vanished into the night. Elias's phone rang as he walked past the town's small diner. The caller ID read, "Mitchell, the sheriff's deputy, who had shown signs of doubt earlier. It had been Mitchell who had quietly passed Elias information. In the days leading up to the sheriff's arrest, Elias had known from the start that Mitchell wasn't fully on board with Daniels's twisted vision of law enforcement. He hadn't expected the deputy to do much. People like Mitchell rarely made waves, but he had acted, and Elias was grateful for that. It was clear now that Mitchell had come to see the depth of Daniel's treachery and had chosen the right side. "Elias," Mitchell's voice crackled through the phone. I've just been informed that the department's already starting to get cleaned up. They're pulling some of the other officers in for questioning. I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Elias smiled, but it was more of a weary grin than one of triumph. "You didn't have to do that, Mitchell, but I'm glad you did." Mitchell's voice faltered, and there was a long pause. "I never realized how bad it really was, Elias. I thought I could just follow the rules. But Daniels, he had everyone fooled, and I was just one of the many who let it happen." "That's why we fight," Elias replied, his voice low but steady. "Because people like Daniels rely on everyone else turning a blind eye, but it's not too late for change. You've got a chance now to do something real. I won't forget this. I won't let what happened here just fade into the past. This town needs to heal, but it also needs accountability." Elias let that sink in. "It will heal, Mitchell, and I'm glad to hear you'll be part of that." The call ended, and Elias stood for a moment, looking up at the sky as the last slivers of daylight disappeared behind the horizon. He knew what Mitchell meant. The town's healing wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. The cracks had been exposed, and with every step toward justice, those cracks would spread wider. There was no going back to the way things had been before, but that wasn't what Elias was looking for. He didn't want to return to the status quo. He wanted something better for this town, something stronger. He wanted a system that worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. As Elias turned back toward the center of town, he noticed something different. People were talking. They weren't huddled in fearful whispers anymore. There were open discussions taking place between the residents, people who had long kept their heads down, now standing tall and sharing stories. Neighbors who had once stayed silent in the face of corruption were now speaking out, organizing, and demanding better for themselves, for their children, for their futures. Maplewood was beginning to realize that they had a voice. They had a right to demand more than what they had been given. Elias walked into the diner, where he was met with the warmth of familiar faces. He nodded at the waitress, who returned his smile. He'd been coming to the diner for years, but today it felt different. There was a feeling of possibility in the air. He sat at the counter, where Mitchell slid into the seat next to him. The deputy was no longer wearing his uniform. Instead, he wore the same faded jacket as the rest of the townsfolk. There was a new look in his eyes, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," Mitchell said, stirring his coffee absently, "about the future, about what happens now. People aren't just going to forget what happened. We've got a long road ahead, and there's a lot of work to do." "Yeah," Elias replied, looking at the half-empty mug in front of him. "But we've got to start. We've got the truth on our side." "Do you really think it's going to be easy?" Mitchell asked, his voice heavy. "I mean, with Daniels gone, sure, but there are others in this town who've been complicit. There's a lot of dirt buried in the system." Elias looked him in the eye, his gaze steady. "No, it won't be easy, but it's worth it. And we're not going to let them just keep doing what they've been doing one step at a time. That's all we can do, and we'll make it count." The bell above the door jingled as a few more people entered the diner, their voices low but excited, the whispers of revolution spreading like wildfire. Elias smiled softly to himself. There was still a long road ahead, but he felt the weight of the victory in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he could finally breathe. As he sat there, in the dim light of the diner, the quiet murmur of the town rising around him, Elias knew something had shifted, not just in Maplewood, but in himself as well. He had been tested, he had been pushed to his limits, but he had made it through. And in the process, he had learned that his resilience, his willingness to stand up for what was right, had made a difference. Elias Cross wasn't just a man fighting for justice, he was part of something much bigger now. A movement for change, a catalyst for the kind of world he had always dreamed of, and this was just the beginning. As the night wore on, Elias paid his bill and stood up to leave. He glanced back at Mitchell, who was deep in conversation with some of the town's more vocal residents. The change was happening, slowly, but surely. With a sense of finality, Elias pushed open the door to the diner and stepped into the cool night air. The stars above gleamed brightly in the clear sky, and for the first time in a long time, Elias felt hopeful. There was still work to be done, but he wasn't alone. Maplewood had taken its first step toward justice, and Elias was ready to see it through.